A sleepy fishing village is rocked by the disappearance of some of their most prominent anglers, and to find them, your players are going to have to leave this plane for one a little stranger. Welcome to Quick Quest, where I give you pre-made side quests and adventures you can drop right into your own game. This adventure is made for 5 players at level 3, but can be very easily tuned up or down depending on the amount of players you have and their levels. I've adapted this from 2 different quests that I ran in my game with a couple of key changes that I think will make it even more fun. But whether you're running this as is or just taking inspiration for your own game, I'd love to hear what you have to think. Without further ado, let's get started. This quest begins with your players arriving in Riverbend, a small fishing village that, like the name suggests, straddles a river. It's only a town of maybe a couple hundred people, and there's not too much to look at. There's the Bait and Tackle Tavern, where fishing nets cover the walls and is run by a cantankerous old angler. There's a general goods store that mostly just supplies all of those said anglers. There's a local town guard station, of course, and maybe one other point of interest, like a shrine to whatever water goddess fits your setting best. Now, when your players arrive here, they're going to need to learn about the people that have gone missing, and in total, 5 folks are gone. 3 of the city's most prominent anglers, and then the 2 guards that were sent to look for them. Now, how your players come across this should feel organic. You don't want them to feel like you're forcing them down one path. So, maybe the player with the highest passive perception notices a couple of missing posters on a wall. Or if they're walking by the guard station, maybe a group of concerned citizens have gathered and they're asking for more information. They want to know about the people that are missing. And be flexible with how they get that information too. There's no reason that those missing posters can't just be on the wall of the general store that they already want to go to, or that those concerned citizens couldn't be gossiping at the Bait and Tackle Tavern that your players decided to stop in first. However they learn about the quest and the associated gold piece reward that I'll let you come up with, your players should eventually make their way to the guard station for more information. Speaking to the town guard, your players will learn that the last time those anglers were seen, they were heading north of town in a shared boat, up toward a forest called the Thorn Grove. The Thorn Grove is a thicket of vines and shrubs and dense trees, and the leading theory is that something or someone in that grove might be responsible for those disappearances. After the anglers hadn't returned the next morning, they did send 2 guards to go look for them, and they haven't come back either. So rather than keep sending guards at the problem, guards that they can't afford to lose in such a small village, they decided to ban anybody from going north of town until they planned their next move. They had been hoping to hire some passing mercenaries, and that's where your party comes in. If your party can return the missing anglers and town guards, or at least what's ever left of them, then they can claim the reward. And if your players accept, then you've got a quest on your hands. Following the river north, your players will eventually reach the Thorn Grove itself. Now, if they're looking for clues already, they could be rolling perception, investigation, survival. As long as they can justify it, they can tackle this problem in a lot of different ways. But if they're not being particularly proactive, you can always use the player with the highest passive perception to help them get some clues and get started. First thing that they should probably notice are, in one section of the river, long drag marks leading from the water into the Thorn Grove itself. And if they do a bit more investigating, they might even find the angler's boat stashed just inside the trees of the grove, so that anybody passing by on the river wouldn't be able to see it. Now, looking into those drag marks with a really good investigation or survival check, they might be able to pick up on very faint footprints that are leading from the water into the grove itself. Some of them are humanoid, but one set of them are cloven, hooved, like some kind of animal. Regardless of how they look, all of the footprints are also heading into the Thorn Grove, and that's where your players are going to need to go next. Now, actually getting through the Thorn Grove should prove a little difficult for your players. This place is full of dense shrubs and trees and vines covered in thorns. It's not exactly an easy place to walk through. So as they're going, you can ask them how they want to traverse the area. Some might want to try to hack and slash their way through with their sword, while a druid might wild shape into something smaller to help them get around. However they choose to do it, have them roll a couple skill checks or attack rolls, and if they do well, great, they're getting through with no problems. But if they roll poorly, maybe they have some minor inconveniences. Things like they get stuck in a bramble and have to be helped out, or they take 1d4 slashing damage from a particularly thorny vine. Nothing too crazy. You don't want to penalize them before they even get to the meat of the quest, but traversing the area can be part of the adventure in itself. And after maybe about an hour of working their way through here, they'll reach a small glade, a clearing in this otherwise cluster of thorns and vines. It's pretty unremarkable, except in the center is a perfect circle of mushrooms, and if they've been following those hoofed footprints, then they'll see that they eventually go right up to that circle and disappear. Clearly this is what they're looking for, but what exactly does it mean? Doing a little investigating around the glade should help clue your players into what's going on. First, with a good enough nature check on the mushrooms themselves, they can learn that fungi is specifically moonshine mushrooms because they glow under the light of the moon. Secondly, with a good enough perception or investigation check, they'll find that some of the trees on the outside of the clearing have crescent moon symbols that are carved into their trunks. Everything should be pointing your players towards sticking around until nightfall. In the meantime, there is an encounter here that they can trigger. If they do anything to harm the glade or the circle of mushrooms, then the protectors of this circle, 3 dryads, will step out of the trees and attack. You can find stats for dryads in the monster manual, but if your players are respectful, then they can wait around for nightfall in peace when the fun really begins. Come nightfall, those mushrooms will start to glow, and a bright light will shine from the center of that circle. Stepping inside, your players will be transported from the prime material plane to the realm of the Feywild. For those that aren't familiar, the Feywild is a different plane of existence that sits on top of the prime material plane, which is where most campaigns take place. Even though it mirrors the material plane in a lot of ways, here nature grows out of control, and the wild creatures and plants that live here, themselves called Fey, are often strange and mischievous in ways that are difficult for mortal travelers to understand. It can be a very, very beautiful place and a very dangerous place if you're not entirely sure what you're doing. Now, the Dungeon Master's Guide does have information on all the different planes of existence, including the Feywild. So if you're not familiar with it, or you just want to brush up on what happens in this weird and wild place, I would suggest taking a look at the notes in here before you run this adventure. Stepping out of the portal, your players will find themselves in a forest that dwarfs the Thorn Grove. The trees here grow impossibly high, their trunks twisting and bending at odd angles. The grass blooms with flowers of all different colors, and some of them even change hues as they watch. Little motes of light fly in between the leaves of the trees, and even though it was night when they stepped into the portal, here it seems like it's the middle of the day. Now, in this clearing that they've stepped into, there is an old signpost in the very center with signs that point off to paths that branch out all through this massive forest. The signs read as follows: Elsewhere, Singing Pools, Chasm, Hero's Hollow, and Burning Tree. If your players have been following those cloven footprints, then they'll find 3 more sets going off in the direction of the Singing Pools, Chasm, and Hero's Hollow. And it'll be up to your players to search these different pathways to find the missing villagers. And while I'm going to detail all of these ideas, feel free to throw in whatever Fey, mischief, and adventures you can think of too. But for this video, let's go ahead and start with Elsewhere. Along this first pass, your players will pretty quickly realize that something is off. No matter what direction they take, the path keeps forking and doubling back and crisscrossing on itself, and they just seem to get more and more lost. If they try to double back and just go the way they came, well, then they end up just right back where they started. Not at the crossroads, mind you, but still within this maze, and it is a maze. Unfortunately for them, once they start walking down this path, they're going to be good and trapped. Now eventually, after a couple attempts to get out, a sprite named Gilva will approach them. And Gilva, of course, knows the way out and would be more than happy to show your party how to get back to the crossroads. For a price. Now keep in mind, Fey deals tend to be a little strange and obtuse to mortals, so maybe he wants one of them to give them their name, and then they can no longer speak their own name and other people forget what it is. Or maybe ask for a little bit of their luck, and the next time that player rolls a natural 20, you flip it into a natural 1 instead. Whatever it is, if they accept the deal, Gilva will be true to their word and lead them back to the Crossroads. But you don't want your players to feel like they're forced to take a deal just to figure out how to move forward. If they want to, they can try other solutions. Maybe if a player is particularly perceptive or really, really intelligent, they can see through the illusion of the maze and get back to the Crossroads. Or of course they could just capture Gilva and intimidate him into taking them back. Whatever floats your party's boat. But if they do try things and they're rolling low and they're not succeeding, you can have them roll DC 10 Constitution saves against levels of exhaustion for the longer that they wander and wander and wander through this maze. But hopefully, eventually, whether with or without Gilva's help, they'll make it back to the Crossroads and have to start again. If your party decides to head toward the singing pools, then they'll watch as the forest around them changes. It goes from more of a sort of temperate forest with big, wide trees that grow super tall to more tropical of a vibe. Palm trees sprout in places. The greenery gets so lush and full of ferns and vines, and eventually they'll begin to hear a sort of humming in the air, like a couple beautiful musical notes that are just slowly building and building and building until eventually the path opens up to the singing pools themselves, where a waterfall tumbles down into all of these clear, bubbling pools of beautiful water. And these pools are pretty popular. It is packed with satyrs, dryads, and pixies, all partying and relaxing and swimming in these pools. As your players watch, they'll see lots of people are drinking from wine bottles that, once empty, refill themselves. And anytime a drunk satyr inevitably breaks one of those bottles, a nymph, sort of feminine, watery fey, will come up out of the pools and replace it with a new bottle full of wine for them to enjoy. Clearly, these nymphs are the ones that are running this party. But the longer your players stick around, the more they might notice some things are a little off. First, some of those partygoers that look really happy, upon closer inspection are tired and worn out, yet they're still smiling and partying with the rest of them. Secondly, where those wine bottles have spilled, the liquid dries more like blood than anything they've ever seen served at a tavern. And lastly, if your players choose to partake, they're going to have to succeed on a DC 12 Constitution saving throw, and on a fail, they become poisoned. Now, this poison isn't deadly, but it makes them feel elated and drunk, even from a single sip. And they join in on the partying until they take damage and get a chance to save again. At this point, once they see some weird stuff going on, your players might decide to leave, which is a perfectly valid decision. But if they want to get to the bottom of things, they're going to have to dive into the pools themselves and see what those nymphs have going on underneath. Diving down to the bottom of the pools, your players will find that they all converge on one central chamber where 5 nymphs have gathered. The bottom of this chamber is littered with the bones of partiers who didn't quite make it out of the singing pools. And up against one wall, they'll see that the nymphs are siphoning the blood out of some kind of weird, slender, dragon-like creature and into those wine bottles. This creature is a Jabberwocky, and you can find the stats for it in the Wild Beyond the Witchlight module, but it's dead, so you don't actually need the stats to run this quest. Now, once your players see this, they might decide to attack the nymphs outright, and that is a perfectly valid course of action. There are no official stat blocks for nymphs, at least not that I could find, so I think merfolk in the monster manual work just as well. But keep in mind, if they're fighting the nymphs in this chamber, they're underwater, and there are different rules for underwater combat that make it a little bit more difficult than fighting on land. So definitely check those out before you run that encounter. That being said, your players don't have to attack the nymphs, and if they instead decide to talk to them, either underwater somehow or back above ground on land, they'll learn that the nymphs don't actually have any ill intentions. They just really like throwing a party, and they found that this creature's blood is the best way to keep the party going. So it's possible that your players could convince them to see the error in their ways, or maybe give them something else that they can use to keep the party going, whether that's regular wine or alcohol or something else. Who knows what your players have on them. But whether they resolve things peacefully or with violence, they'll eventually make their way back to the surface, can smash the remaining wine bottles, and all of the partiers trapped up there can sober up and come back to their senses. Their reward for not just running away once they saw that stuff was getting weird up here is information, as some of those satyrs that are now sober will have seen the villagers heading in the direction of the Chasm, and so they'll know that's the path that they need to follow. don't worry, if your players didn't get this far, if they turned around and went back, or they just didn't take the time to figure out what was going on with the singing pools, they can get this information in other ways, in some of the other pathways that I'm going to talk about. Trekking the next path to Heroes Hollow, your players will eventually find it blocked by a massive fallen tree, but this tree has been turned into a tavern, the namesake Heroes Hollow. Stepping inside, they'll find that the tables seem to grow up out of the wood itself. Small balls of light float around the ceiling to brighten up the space, and the Eladrin and satyrs that come here sit at a long wooden bar with casks of ale and wine behind it. The other really notable thing about this tavern is that the walls are covered with weapons, armor, and shields, all from heroes that have passed through here before, kind of like the photos of celebrities that diners will put up on their walls. If your party talks to the owner, a satyr named Bilius, he'll be ecstatic to have the next group of up-and-coming heroes here at his tavern, if the players can convince him that they're actually heroes, that is. If your players have already accomplished heroic feats in your campaign, then they could just tell Bilius about that, but even if they haven't, or at most they've killed some rats and bandits, then they can always lie. Bilius is not infallible, but he has heard his fair share of tall tales over the years, so I'd give him +4 to insight to see through any of their lies. If they're able to convince Bilius that they are true heroes, then they'll be allowed to drink for free and stay as long as they'd like. But if he deems them less than worthy, they're going to have to cough up a little bit of gold in order to truly enjoy the hollow. If he is impressed by them, he might even let them in on a rumor that he's heard about mortals brought to the Feywild by a rival satyr named Cyrus and taken in the direction of the Chasm. Whether they got to truly enjoy the Hero's Hollow, or it was more of a bit of an ego check, they can head back to the Crossroads to find another pass and see what else the Feywild has in store for them. 2 more quick notes that could come up depending on your party. If they do try to take anything off of the walls, they'll find that they're sealed there with a permanent version of the immovable object spell. And if they do try to steal things or attack Bilius or the bar in any way, they'll provoke the wrath of the Lady of Light, the Archfey that watches over Heroes Hollow. Those bright lights that are floating around the ceiling will begin to glow and shine even brighter, and they'll hear the lady's voice telling them to cut it out. If they don't listen and keep provoking her, eventually she will coalesce into her true form, and you can use the stats of a Spring Eladrin, which should be more than enough to handle your party of level 3 players. Once they're knocked out, they'll be kicked back to the Crossroads and not allowed in Heroes Hollow. You don't want to kill them, but there should be consequences for their actions. So if the little loot goblins can't keep their hands to themselves, they'll end up back at square one without being able to rest or use the tavern anymore. Following the next path in the direction of Burning Tree, your players will see the forest around them once again start to change. The trees there get a little bit shorter, but they start to grow these really beautiful bright red-orange flowers. If one of your players tries to pick one though, it'll explode in a fireball, and they'll have to make a DC 10 dexterity saving throw or take 3d6 fire damage. The path will eventually lead to the Burning Tree, a huge tree with branches hundreds of feet wide that stretch out over a big clearing, and those branches are full of those same red-orange flowers, just like the rest of the forest around it. It's also full of small little round wicker homes, which are the homes of tons of fairies, sprites, and pixies that live within the tree. And when your players approach, at first, those fairies will be flittering all around the leaves and the tree branches, but the moment they spot the party, they'll go back into their homes to hide. It'll be up to your players to convince them that they don't mean them any harm, they don't mean them any trouble, and they can do that with persuasion, deception, magic, whatever means they find necessary. If they do manage to convince the fairies that they're friendly, then the fairies will actually be able to help them out. They've seen the villagers that your players are looking for, and they're willing to tell them where they are if they help the fairies out with the problem they're having. Recently, tiny little fey creatures called boggles have been infesting the parts of the forest around Burning Tree, playing tricks on and frightening the fairies that live there. If your players can find one of these boggles and bring it back to them, dead or alive, then they'll help the players out and tell them where those villagers went. You can find stats for boggles in Monsters of the Multiverse, and keep in mind they have a +6 to their stealth, so they're not going to be easy for your players to find. But let them be creative in how they want to tackle this problem. Your druid might want to use survival to track them and look for any signs of them in the nearby forest, whereas an artificer might construct some kind of elaborate trap to capture one when it comes by. Now, when they do lay eyes on a boggle, they're going to have to capture it, either dead or alive, so they could just attack it. Boggles only have about 18 average HP, so not exactly hard to fight, or they could try to grapple it or capture it or ensnare it with magic. If they do try to physically grab them, keep in mind that boggles have an ability that, as a bonus action, let them secrete slippery oil from their skin and gives them advantage on grapple checks. So might lead to some shenanigans as the boggles are sprinting around the forest and your players are trying to grab them and watching them slip out of their grasp. Speaking of shenanigans, your players with higher passive perception will notice that they're being watched, not by anything sinister, but by the fairies from Burning Tree, who are just keeping tabs on their progress. And when they bring back a boggle, either dead or alive, they'll see why. The fairies didn't actually really care about the boggles that much. They mostly just wanted to watch your players struggle trying to capture one. In fact, if it was pretty easy for your players to accomplish that task, they might even be a little upset they didn't get more of a show. But they will be true to their word, and they'll let your players know that they saw the villagers, surprise, surprise, heading toward the chasm. Eventually, either because they were tipped off following another path or literally exhausted all other options, your players will head toward the chasm. Now, if for some reason this was the first path they chose to follow, you can always throw some Feywild themed random encounters at them. Maybe a redcap leaps out and attacks them, or they find some talking mushrooms who beg them to eat them, and of course those mushrooms end up being poisonous. But eventually they'll reach the end of the path where it opens up into a massive canyon, one that stretches for miles in every direction and is about several hundred feet across. Suspended all throughout this canyon, chunks of rock float like islands in the air, and on one of them, maybe about 75-80 feet away, will be a hut that has been built on top of one of these chunks of rock. That's where the villagers have been taken, and that's where your players need to get to. Now, they can just try to jump from rock to rock to get there, and that'll be a DC 14 athletics check. But if they want to use spells, abilities, or tools like a grappling hook maybe to help them out, you can always lower that DC based on what they're trying. If a player does fail a check, you can describe how they begin plummeting to their death and then are suspended about 30 feet down in the air. They're not going to die, they're not going to fall all the way to the bottom, but they will be stuck down there, and it'll be up to the other players to help fish them up and get everybody, hopefully, to the hut safely. Upon reaching the hut, your players will find no windows, but if they listen at the door, they'll hear beautiful pan flute music coming through. There'll be a bit of a pause eventually for some cheering and applause before the music picks up again. The door itself is unlocked, so if your players want to step inside, they can. And they'll find that the interior of the hut is a lot bigger than it looks on the outside. There is a beautiful chandelier hanging from the ceiling, a long bar with what looks like expensive wine and goblets on display. And across the way from where they've entered is a small stage with some plush seating surrounding it. And on that stage, a satyr in fine silks and expensive-looking jewelry plays his pan flute for an adoring audience. An audience that is composed of the 3 missing villagers and 2 town guards, as well as an eladrin and a dwarf who, despite their kind of frilly tunic, has an axe strapped across their back. The satyr playing on stage is Cyrus, the man that your players have been looking for, and finally they've tracked him down to his hut. Looking at the audience, it'll be pretty apparent that they are charmed. They're being held here against their will. Their vacant stares and inability to do much beyond cheer and clap will be pretty dead giveaways that Cyrus is mind controlling them somehow and forcing them to listen to his music. But that said, Cyrus will assume that your party are adoring fans here to see him play, so he won't exactly be expecting violence. But seeing this scene, your players might decide to attack, and if that happens, Cyrus and the audience will become hostile, and it's time to roll initiative. Now, Cyrus uses the satyr stats that can be found in the monster manual with 2 key changes. 1, he can cast Charm Person using his pan flute as an action, and 2, I'd bump his HP up to 50, because you want him to stick around for a little bit and not just be instantly taken out by your players. This should be a pretty challenging fight, as all of the audience are doing their best to put themselves between Cyrus up on stage and your players down below. You can use commoner stat blocks for the villagers and for the Eladrin who was captured there. You can use the Berserker stat block for the dwarf, and of course you can use town guard stats for the 2 town guards. All of those are also found within the monster manual. All this being said, it doesn't have to come to violence. Killing him will break his hold over the audience, but your players can convince him to do it voluntarily as well. Cyrus is vain and egotistical. He thinks he is the best musician in all the realms. And if your players play into that ego, maybe they get him to prove it. Maybe they tell him that he doesn't need his magic. He's so good that he can release his hold on the audience and they'll still stick around just for his beautiful music. Or maybe they try to bruise that ego, mocking him and telling him, oh, if you're so good, well, why do you have to charm your audience in the first place? So he can be persuaded or fooled into dropping the charm that way. The other way they can solve things non-violently is that his magic comes from that pan flute. So if they get it from him and break it, that'll break the charm. Or they can threaten to break it, and that might be enough to get him to do it voluntarily because he needs that pan flute to play his beautiful music. Whether they did it through violence or through peace, your players will eventually get that charm broken and free the missing villagers. And that will be the end of this quick quest. With Cyrus's hold over them broken, the villagers will be more than happy to accompany your players back through the portal to the Prime Material Plane. The dwarf and Eladrin they also saved will thank them for the help, the Eladrin heading back to whatever Fey city they're from, and the dwarf coming back to the Prime Material Plane with the villagers. If your party aren't quite ready to leave yet, they can always send the villagers on through and then explore some of the paths that they might not have gone into during the main part of the quest. When they do head through the portal, you can let them return on the same night they left, or if you want to be a little mean, the Dungeon Master's Guide does have some optional rules for Feywild crossing. And particularly, when you leave the Feywild, sometimes players have to make a wisdom check to retain any of the memories that they got there, and you might also roll to see how much time has passed. So, suddenly, when they leave the portal, some of them might not even remember they went to the Feywild in the first place. And it also might have been like a year. That's a little mean and might not fit every campaign, but it's also kind of fun. So definitely keep it in your back pocket if you want to use it on your players. Regardless, when they get back to Riverbend, everybody will be overjoyed to see the villagers returned, and your players can get free drinks at the Bait and Tackle Tavern, as well as the reward as promised. They're heroes, so they should be treated like it. That ends this edition of Quick Quest. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you do end up running this in your game, definitely let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how it went and any changes that you think could make it even better. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and maybe even subscribing to the Bard's College. I make content about D&D and DMing, so if you like what you saw, definitely stick around. But for now, good luck, and remember, crit your players.